5.3 million Americans are not allowed to vote because of criminal convictions. These Americans are excluded from a democratic process on the basis of criminal disenfranchisement laws. These laws strip voting rights from people with past criminal convictions, and they vary really widely between states. Kentucky and Iowa, for example, impose lifetime disenfranchisement for people with felony convictions, unless the government grants an individual pardon. Some states restore voting rights upon release from prison, others upon completion of probation or parole, the payment of all and any fines or fees. Others impose a waiting period, regardless of the completion of your sentence. Maybe it's 10 years, maybe it's longer. There's a list of contingencies, and often a process that you have to go through to have your voting rights restored, because it's not necessarily an automatic thing. We're going to use current U.S. Senator, former Florida Governor Rick Scott as a bit of a case study today to talk about just how unfair it is that people who have served their time can no longer vote. Because of his former position as a member on the Board of Pardons and Paroles, he's in a really prime place to discuss just exactly how arbitrary and antithetical to public safety felon disenfranchisement actually is. I don't know if anyone has pegged Rick Scott as well as John Oliver did in an episode concerning felon disenfranchisement. Here's a clip from that episode.
Fact is, Florida is the disenfranchisement capital of America. So how did that happen? Well, for starters, a post-Civil War change to their constitution stripped all convicted felons of their voting rights for life. And while Florida's governor can restore those rights, the current one, Rick Scott, implemented a system where you have to wait 5 to 7 years just to apply to get your vote back, then submit an application, then wait more, then, in many cases, have to travel to Tallahassee, which no one should ever have to do under any circumstances, to argue your case in person. These obstacles are ridiculous and unnecessary, and this is how Scott justified them.
Look, if you are a convicted felon, part of what you did is you lost your rights. And so you ought to, there ought to be a process if you're going to get those rights back. And I think it's fair to the rest of the citizens of the state, and they'll see a process that they know will work.
This is a board of clemency. Okay, there's no law we're following. The law had already been followed by the judges. So we get to make our decisions based on our own beliefs. There's no standards. Each of us have the right opportunity to make a decision based on what we believe. This is a court of mercy. It's not a court. There's no, if you walk up and say, I deserve something, that's not how this works. There's absolutely no standards. So we can make any decisions we want.
Scott says flat out, there are no standards, there are no rules, there are no minimums. We do what we want, when we want, because we want. And that's the extent of it. Moral posturing is to publicly adopt a position and make a show of it. It doesn't always relate to political or ideological issues, but it's a very clear, conspicuous front that's used by people to project a certain character or traits that they want people to believe that they have. It's very similar to our social media interactions, where maybe we fill out a list of our favorite books on Facebook, but it's a list of books that we are entirely aware convey a certain thing or image about ourselves, and that we really don't fool anybody by pretending to have read, especially people who have studied those books in depth. It's very similar to a commonly used term called virtue signaling. This is something that we saw at mass during Blackout Tuesday, when a slew of corporations came out to combat police brutality and racism, only to be very rightfully criticized by their own employees and by experts who knew their company's practices very well, especially contradictory practices like huge wage disparities between employees or completely homogenous boardrooms. This is when actions that otherwise would seem moral, or statements that appear to be moral or well-intended, come across as clear virtue signaling. And moral posturing, deep down, is not really just about principles or deviations between principles and practices. It's about arrogance, and it's an arrogance that leads us to overlook the gaps in our own character and become adamant that we really understand the character of people that we don't even know. So since we've been going with Florida so well, let's take, for example, Rick Scott. Now, Rick Scott oversaw the Board of Paroles in Florida, and he was one of a handful of decision makers who could or could not give a formerly convicted person their right back to vote after they served their sentence. Here we see Rick Scott in an interview with CNN's John King, and he's asked to speak to his own character following a major fraud case that he was involved in back in 1997. It's important to note here that when Rick Scott was the CEO of this company, it was found to have defrauded Medicare, Medicaid, and several other federal programs. The Department of Justice ultimately fined that company $1.7 billion in what has become the largest healthcare fraud settlement in U.S. history. In a settlement with the government, the company admitted to 14 felonies related to fraudulent billing and malicious practices, and most of these happened under Scott's leadership. And when he was interviewed by the FBI, he took the fifth, a total of 75 times. When the federal investigation of that former company became public in 1997, the board forced him out, and he left with $300 million in stock and a $5.1 million severance, as well as a $950,000 per year consulting contract for 5 years. Rick Scott himself, not unlike other C-suite executives whose companies are found guilty of felonies, wasn't actually charged with any crimes. But still, years later, he did provide a sort of quasi-confession that he wasn't entirely without blame. When he ran his first campaign, he told voters at a press conference, quote, "I learned very hard lessons from what happened, and those lessons have helped me become a better businessman and leader," end quote. Yeah, those lessons may have done all of those things, but they certainly didn't leave him with the mark of becoming a convicted felon, despite the felonies that he very likely took a very active role in.
When you were the chairman of Columbia HCA, you once gave a deposition, this is in January 1997, in which you were being asked questions about some letters that were key to a fraud case. And you said you didn't know if you had signed those letters, and you said, quote, "I sign letters all the time that I have not read." If you were the chief executive of the state of Florida, is that the practice you will employ?
Well, if you look at the letters you sign a lot of letters when you're a CEO of a company. It's, award letters and all sorts of things like that. So there's a lot of letters that you sign. You trust the people around you.
Letters that were critical to trying to prove fraud allegations.
Yeah, I don't know that issue at all. But,
you don't know the issue on which you gave a deposition that involved your company?
Not a long time ago. Not, 13 years ago.
Scott was also accused of breaking political rules for allowing public officials to aid him in his campaign for re-election while they were on the clock. Here we see Scott ditch the evasion technique for what we call doublespeak. It's where a politician does not answer a direct question while also managing to speak, usually just to recite their talking points and to virtue signal.
And tonight there's a mini scandal brewing in Florida over a campaign stop by Governor Rick Scott. 2 weeks ago, the governor was campaigning for re-election in Tampa with a group of uniformed law enforcement officers lined up behind him. There you see the picture. The problem is it's illegal in Florida for public employees to participate in campaign events on the clock or in uniform, and an official complaint has been filed with the state. Take a look.
Did you really think that all of those deputies were off duty?
Gosh, I'm very proud that last week the police chiefs endorsed me. I'm very proud that 40 sheriffs have endorsed me. I'm very proud of all the support from the law enforcement. We're at a 43-year low in our crime rate. So we invite them to our campaign events, and I'm very appreciative of the ones that came.
But did you think it was a problem to have on-duty law enforcement there?
I'm very appreciative of both their support and those that come to my events.
You didn't answer that question. Should there be discipline?
Look, I'm appreciative of everybody that comes to my events. And gosh, we're at a 43-year low in our crime rate. We should be very supportive of our law enforcement.
Rick Scott manages to not only give a nod to the law enforcement who support his campaign, but he also manages to virtue signal, essentially insinuating that the question about the officers was a subtle attack on the officers themselves. When he says, quote, "We should support our law enforcement," end quote, he recites his talking point. The thing is, his support for law enforcement was not in question. It was their attendance at his campaign event. We, the public, presumed already that having them stand behind you like some sort of brigade was your idea, not theirs. And Rick confirmed this when he stated, "We invite them to our events." So actually, the target of the question was him, Rick, not law enforcement officers. But by pretending the question is directed at law enforcement, he's able to shield himself from admitting that he broke the rules. So in his capacity as CEO and as governor, and now senator, Rick Scott has never been criminally tried for any of his behaviors. And because of this, he's able to justify the damage and disrespect that his actions have shown, and to continue to morally posture above people who were not so fortunate as to escape prosecution for far, far less. If you keep your eye on anyone long enough, you'll find an opportunity to call them on their shit. That's because no human being is without a core character flaw: self-interest. Glenn Lawson, a philosophy professor at the University of Rhode Island, wrote, "The more expertise that people claim about the most important things in life, such as justice and virtue and the best way to live, the less likely it is they can actually justify their claims. I'll be generally suspicious of anyone who claims to be superiorly moral."
The question that always comes immediately to mind with restoring the vote to felons is, America as a country does not trust you to carry a gun. So why would we trust you to choose the next president?
Tucker Carlson makes one of the strangest correlations I think I've ever heard with regard to whether or not felons should be permitted to vote. Whether or not anyone, I don't care if you're a felon or not, has the competency, the ethics, the decency to carry a gun, to carry something that could kill you, is a very, very different standard than one should use versus whether or not determining whether or not someone should cast a ballot for the school superintendent. I really don't even understand the logic behind that. I don't understand that correlation at all. All rights are not the same. There are greater implications for certain rights than there are for other rights. The rights of someone to own property, the rights of someone to be exempt or subject to search and seizure, those are all different rights, and they most of the time do not impact the rights of anyone else. But with regard to voting rights, what we're talking about is our individual ability to participate in society. Right, at this level, just in this level, there are so many different elements of civic participation, right? Like there are several states in which, even as a convicted felon, you can run for office, you can hold elected office. Being a convicted felon does not prevent you from writing op-eds or starting a television program and therefore influencing the masses in huge numbers, far more than you possibly could by going down to the polls. Voting is literally the lowest common denominator of civic participation. It truly is. It's not grand jury service. It's not holding a position in the state as a prosecutor, or let alone as a judge. It is such a low form of civic participation, and it really is the lowest common denominator, and in many parts, the great equalizer. Voting is the sole great equalizer, the sole element of community and civic participation that is not dependent upon anything else. It doesn't matter if you have a car, if you don't have a car. It doesn't matter if you have a home, or if you don't own your home. It doesn't matter if you're homeless, or if you're someone who makes 6 figures a year, 7 figures a year, or if you're someone who's working a minimum wage job. If that, you are still only entitled to one vote. The problem with Scott's logic is that actually convicted felons don't just lose their rights, especially their individual rights. They have the right to get married, to get divorced, to buy property, to sell property. They have their First Amendment rights, that is to free speech. Yeah, all preserved for felons. Even when they're incarcerated, a person who is behind bars can write letters to the editor, can write books, can podcast. Yeah, podcast. If we understand voting as an aspect of First Amendment protections, meaning your right to voice your beliefs, then the really anomalous policy of restricting voting rights becomes very clearly one that is strictly political or even more heinous. Imagine someone being completely free to subscribe to Newsweek magazine. They can exercise their free speech with regard to meeting with leaders, with regard to making phone calls or engaging in other forms of communication to advocate for certain issues or beliefs. They can even submit op-ed articles to the New York Times or Washington Post, which has happened very recently and increasingly frequently. Their published words can reach millions of readers. In all these cases, let alone when, again, someone may choose to run for office, as 4 convicted felons did in 2018 on the Republican ticket. All of those activities are far more influential than casting a ballot. And there's no restrictions on those types of communications. Finally, there is a process for having one's rights restored. And traditionally, and I think logically, we consider that process to be serving one's sentence, right? Being incarcerated for a period of time, maybe paying back one's fines or fees to a victim crime, not a victimless crime. Maybe it includes community service. Maybe it includes, the restriction of Second Amendment rights. Maybe it involves the loss of custody of one's child. I mean, the list can kind of go on, but we do not lose our rights when we are found guilty of an act. That's just not how it works. We even have the right to fair trials when we are under investigation for said acts. We have the right to remain safe and secure in our persons. We have a whole bunch of rights. So there is no such thing as just waking up one day and being completely absolved of any and all constitutional protection. That's just not how it works. Another fun fact: even though voting is a very important form of civic participation, fundamentally, in terms of impact, voting is actually kind of the lowest common denominator of civic participation. It's one of the least consequential forms of participation. The chances that one vote is going to make a huge difference in an election are multi-millions to one. But there are other ways that we do allow felons to participate in our democracy outside of the vote that make restricting the vote a little nonsensical. Think about all the other things felons are doing to influence the political process, like one of the creme de la creme examples, holding public office. Republicans have 4 convicted criminals who ran for Congress in 2018, and they're still the most adamant against enabling felons the right to vote. People in prison are also able to do other things like exercise free speech. They can have op-eds published in the Washington Post and the New York Times. They can communicate their thoughts to the outside world, letters, phone calls, emails, etc. In almost all cases, that activity is far more influential than just casting one amongst hundreds of millions of ballots in an election. But there are almost no restrictions, there's almost no restriction placed on that form of influence. So if you do believe that for some reason any influence from someone with a criminal history on the electoral process has to be avoided, then you have to acknowledge that a single vote should be at the lowest common denominator of civic participation.
The truth is, there is no proof or logical reason, let alone a moral one, that ex-felons are any more likely to abuse the ballot than the remainder of the population. What about superspeeders, litterers, people with bad credit, people with tax liens, adulterers, deadbeat parents, or college students with shitty grades? Committers of small, indecent acts, like cutting in lines, or folks who lie about their 13-year-olds being 12 years old so they can get a discounted meal. Who's to say that these bad acts versus nonviolent offenses versus misdemeanors versus felony convictions make anyone more or less likely to, quote, preserve the integrity of the ballot box? The integrity of the ballot box is a virtue signal, and that implies that most voters respect voting enough to say, understand their votes. But we know that that's not true, because not all voters are informed voters. I mean, sure, most of us do our best, but quite frankly, if the state was that concerned about equipping voters with all the tools and resources that they would need to make informed decisions, they wouldn't allow just any voter to stroll into a voting booth and cast a ballot for offices that they don't even understand the functions of. Wouldn't an ignorant voter compromise the ballot box's integrity? Say, for example, the fact that you have to take an exam to drive a car. That means that you have to acquire a specific set of skills or knowledge. But to vote, that's not the case. You aren't required to thoroughly research the candidates or issues before voting. You aren't required to take a civic education course or to even care about an issue before making a decision on it, even though it will affect the lives of other people. In fact, you can write in absolutely anyone for president, your uncle, your own left toe, and that's totally fine in our society. We can go pretty far with determining who should or shouldn't vote based upon our own moral posturing. What about aged voters? Those diagnosed with mental illnesses, those on certain medications? What about those having a bad day? That may make them more liable to make a rash decision. This can go pretty far if we're concerned about the purity of a ballot box. We have no business cherry-picking our voters or litmus testing our voting motivations. When we do, we violate every constitutional metric of fairness that currently does exist.
What's important to understand here is that the punishment for felony offenses exists even if everyone who has been disenfranchised from voting gets that right back. Criminal convictions in this country come with a lifelong sentence of their own. Whether it's 10 months, 10 years, or 30 years, people are barred from participating in society in the way that they would have before they made their mistakes or were found guilty of those mistakes. Exclusions from several high-paying industries, exclusions from state employment, the ability to pursue higher education, the ability to bear arms and protect their own homes, their own property, their own families, still prohibited if you're a felon. In conclusion, serving someone's time is making amends. All other desires for punishment are just evidence of an irrational bloodlust for punishment.